Welcome to Studio One Live. I'm Hey Rude the Guru, and this is Rude Radio.
I know every town the same, every place I go. People telling stories about the places on you. You can play it smart or just be a damn fool. Every town the same, every place I go. People telling stories about the block and how it's gone. Every choice you make leave consequences on you. You can play it smart or just be a damn fool. Or just be a damn fool. I know,
We will roast your program. And all YouTubers and content creators alike. Come TV!
It seemed so full of purpose. I found myself wondering, what does it really mean to be alive?
You just said it, sir. It was full of purpose. If you have purpose and you are alive.
To us about non-organic life. Be talking to us about non-organic life. Be talking to us about non-organic life.
Be careful.
Not to lump consciousness and intelligence in the same bucket. I don't think these are synonyms, but I don't think three-dimensional space is the only space in which to do that. And so if you're doing that in physiological state space, or you're doing it in transcriptional space, or you're doing it in anatomical morpho space, or metabolic space, or linguistic space, I think that's good enough. I don't think there's anything, I don't think this three-dimensional space is privileged. I think we treat it that way because that's how our sensory motor system developed, and we're really used to things that move around well in the three-dimensional world being the interesting, intelligent things like us. But that's just, I think that's just prejudice on our part. I think these other spaces in which other beings strive and suffer are equally real. It's prejudice on our part. I think these other spaces in which other beings strive and suffer are equally real. It's prejudice on our part. I think these other spaces in which other beings strive and suffer are equally real.
Here's a new ontology. The fundamental nature of reality is a network of conscious agents outside of space-time. But we, of course, to do science, need not only to make that theory mathematically precise, but we need to predict stuff inside space-time, like scattering processes in climate. So either we're going to deny that there are such entities, or we're going to have to posit that there are entities outside of space-time that engage in dynamics. And
that might be one of the oldest proposals in the entire history books, though, in some sense, right?
Yeah.
I feel like all ancient peoples, to a certain extent, have posited the existence of entities outside of space-time. I mean, they wouldn't have used the same language, obviously, but...
right. There have been, throughout human history, there's been the mystical tradition that says that space-time isn't the fundamental nature of reality. So I think many mystical traditions have said that, that there's some kind of consciousness. We have to put scare quotes on it right now. As a scientist, right, it's just a word, but there's some kind of notion of consciousness, maybe the dynamics of consciousness outside of space-time. So here we have the chance now to actually have a rapprochement and actual mutual learning between science and spirituality. If it turns out that, and now I'm going way beyond what the physicists are saying here, right? So what I'm saying now is I'm not pinning any of this on physicists, like these high-energy theoretical physicists. They might look at me and go, this is nonsense, right? We have amplitude theorem, we have decorated permutations, and we don't have consciousness such consciousness.
Well, science is so devoid of spirit. Scientists are allergic to the very idea that you would speak of there being a consciousness that permeates all the way through. Like we were speaking to somebody the other day who studies desire. And he was like, the oak tree doesn't have any desire. And it was taken as an immediate given foundation for the precepts that were built on top of it. And I've always thought that that's a somewhat short-sighted construction, that the complexity of of life and of will and of all of these conscious movements begins at the human brain, basically. And that seems to always be the problem, because you look at the human brain and you're like, well, how does it happen that we have all these experiences, and where do they come from? And it's like, well, for me, I place the foundation much farther back, where I'm like, well, we have to understand life and the origin of life, and then we can start to trace back what is consciousness and everything else. But it seems like you go even farther to the more fundamental, where you're like, no, we have to understand what is outside of all of this, what gives rise to all of it, and then we can resolve this notion of mind-body duality.
Can I also add that I know somebody's typing a comment right now, like, you guys need to change the name of your show to Mystifying Science. Like, that's what always happens when we stray into this territory. But I want to just push back on that too, because I think that ignoring the mystical traditions is a really stupid thing to do too, because it's been so important for thousands and thousands of years, and I think that it's a little bit arrogant to treat our ancestors as if they're just superstitious cavemen, right? And to treat our ancestors as if they're just superstitious cavemen, right? I think people, in some sense, did know how to live. They at least got us here today, right? They built this civilization that I'm privileged to experience. They built this civilization that I'm privileged to experience. They built this civilization that I'm privileged to experience. And so there probably is a lot of truth in the stories that they were telling. And so in some sense, the better we can do to understand that and to unify it with our scientific understanding of the world is really, in some sense, demystifying the entire experience. We're really understanding things better. And that's our job, really, as thinkers or scientists, is to understand the universe, to get to know this place better.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the mystical traditions had some very good ideas. They probably had some nonsense. Just like in science, we have great theories, and then, of course, most of the theories we come up with are nonsense. That's just the way it goes. But ultimately, I think there's going to be a synergy between the two. Now, what's going on right now is that it turns out that space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. So that the foundation of most physicalist science, the reductionist physicalist science, that says as you go to smaller and smaller regions of space, you get more and more fundamental elements of reality and more fundamental laws that describe those fundamental elements. That's the reductionist, what you might call a micro-reductionist approach to science. Well, we have now a clear understanding that falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, probably well before. So that reductionism is not going to be the final answer, because space-time itself is not the final answer. And it's been the success of space-time, the incredible success of space-time as a framework for science for the last several centuries, that has led many scientists to say we don't need the spiritual stuff. Look at all the stuff we're doing with this space-time assumption. Well, but now the glory of science is that it comes along and says, wow, that assumption really worked for me for several centuries, but that assumption is false. That assumption is not fundamental. Space-time has to emerge from something deeper. What? Science can't tell you. I mean, you have to go out there and look and make your own theories about what's deeper than space-time. And so when we go out there and look for something that's deeper than space-time, why not look at consciousness? What else do you look for? We're looking for dynamical entities outside of space-time. I'm happy to have anybody propose whatever dynamical entities outside space-time they want. I'm proposing consciousness. But if you have some others, that's perfectly fine. You might say, I just want some kind of automata. And I think there are some approaches that are like that. Maybe Stephen Wolfram's kind of approach might be more like that. And what I'm proposing is, okay, now science is taking its first baby steps outside of the headset. What are we going to find? Well, what we're finding right now is, amplitude-hedra and decorative permutations. But what we're really going to find is there's this network of conscious agents ready to greet us in permutations. But what we're really going to find is there's this network of conscious agents ready to greet us in permutations. But what we're really going to find is there's this network of conscious agents ready to greet us, and we need to study consciousness in its full, social interaction complexity. So I think that the concept of life can be understood in two very different ways. These may be complementary as much as they're contradictory, but each of them, I think, carries with it profound implications for the way in which we understand the nature of archaeological evidence. So in one view, life is characterized by cellular organisms, distinguished by an autonomous metabolism and the ability to reproduce themselves. The other presents life as the capacity of complex and heterogeneous systems to generate emergent phenomena. That is, it's the process of the world's becoming. Now, I think this latter has bearing on recent discussions on the efficacy and affectiveness of material things, and it invites us to consider what we might mean by non-organic life. The distinction here is between seeing life as something that's contained within particular kinds of beings and seeing all things as caught up in and animated by the flows and fluxes of life. Organic life forms, then, acquire energy mostly derived from photosynthesis and deploy this to build a metabolism which they use to grow, sustain themselves and reproduce. Thus they evade the tendency of things to move towards their lowest possible energy state. Organisms are both separated from their environment by a membrane and highly internally compartmentalized, notably at the level of organs, cells, enabling functional differentiation and the parallel operation of innumerable biochemical processes. The bounding membrane is at once the source of the organism's individuation and its temporality and spatiality. And moreover, the membrane is the foundation of autopoiesis, the self-maintenance and the reproduction, and arguably also the consciousness of the organism. As autonomous bounded entities, organisms, from unicellular creatures upwards, are capable of a degree of intentionality or directedness towards things like sources of sustenance. Now, all of this suggests a clear and absolute distinction between organisms, highly structured bodies that can acquire and regulate sources of energy, and bodies of inert matter. But in practice, I want to suggest that there are grey areas between life and non-life, so that it may be more appropriate to think of a continuum than a binary separation. For instance, scientists disagree over whether viruses are alive or not. Viruses are contained within a protein capsid. They carry genetic material and they evolve through natural selection, but they have no metabolism and they need to hijack the processes of a host cell in order to reproduce. Further, the initial emergence of organic life must have involved a transition between increasingly structured chemical systems, perhaps cooperating networks of nucleic acids and enzymes, and bounded forms capable of maintaining and replicating themselves. So there's a climb between the two. So, despite the distinctive character of organisms, living and non-living matter may be stratified and interpenetrating rather than separated by an unbridgeable gulf. This isn't an argument for a flat and homogeneous universe, so much for richness and diversity that doesn't always fall into clear and pre-given categories. However, the boundary between life and non-life is one that has acquired great significance in the modern West, since it renders the latter as something that can be damaged, extracted, and consumed with impunity, since it has no moral status of its own. This outlook is what Elizabeth Povinelli refers to as the carbon imaginary, which contrasts metabolism and reproduction with inertia, inanimacy, and barrenness. For her, this perspective can be identified with Kant, who distinguishes life from matter, which can't move itself and is consequentially inert. As Karen Barad points out, the distinction between the animate and the inanimate is even more deeply ingrained than that between culture and nature, and it's only now starting to be challenged by the emphasis on the lively and vibrant qualities of matter associated with the work of people like Jane Bennett. Those non-Westerners who insist on the animacy of material things have traditionally been dismissed as primitive, irrational, and fetishistic. So the Kantian view is that matter needs to be supplemented by some kind of force if it's to become organised or mobile. That is, either an external hylomorphic imposition or an internal inequality or vital principle. But as Tim Ingold argues, it's a mistake to imagine that animacy is an inherent quality, property of material things, or something that's been endowed on them from outside by humans. Rather, it's the consequence of the dynamic working together of the field of relationships that makes up the world, and through which entities of all kinds emerge into being. In this sense, all things are animate, but not in the same way, or to the same degree, or at the same time scale. This brings us to our second understanding of life, not as the prerogative of specific kinds of being, but as the capacity of an animate world to generate diversity and complexity through the process of morphogenesis. In this process, forms emerge at massively variable rates from the flux of the matter flow. They achieve coherence, and then they dissipate. According to such a view, it's not individual beings to the living, but creation in its entirety. Looked at in this way, it's possible to contest the argument that only organisms are able to have overcome the universe's inexorable movement towards entropy and disorder. At the individual level, organisms perish, and it's only through reproduction that their form is maintained. But equally, emergent self-organisation is present in a variety of non-biological phenomena, and I think it can be claimed to be the principle that links together organic and non-organic aspects of the process of life. Self-organisation, then, can draw together different forms of matter of various kinds in order to produce novel emergent properties. This can occur spontaneously under conditions of non-equilibrium. Manuel Delander describes what he calls the machinic phylum, a diverse range of self-organising processes, in which previously unconnected entities sync together and form new assemblages that operate to bring about tangible effects in the world. Delander specifically draws attention to what he calls chemical clocks, systems that oscillate regularly rather than tending into equilibrium. And he emphasises the way that the matter can sometimes apparently respond to fluctuations in its surroundings. Jane Bennett, too, points to the unending processes in which matter does not come to a standstill, but self-assembles into crystals, convection currents, snowflakes, whirlpools, and weather systems, specifically where unstable conditions provide a field of individuation for emergent phenomena. Because all of these things are linked in the continuous becoming of a world distinguished by shifting potentials, shifting temperature, pressure, energy, and so on, it's possible to make comparisons between processes that occur in the geological, chemical, and biological realms. The reason why we can describe some of these phenomena as the non-organic components of the process of life is because they're creative, because they bring new things into the world. It's creativity that links organic and non-organic aspects of the process of life. Timothy Morton suggests life is more than just persistence. It's the limitless process through which the world renews itself. Individual organisms perish, but life both continues and brings forth unending novelties. In the organic register, this occurs through biological evolution, so that Deleuze and Guattari describe the organism as a resting point between bursts of creativity. But equally, complex material systems composed of diverse elements, which may or may not include organic life, also generate new things, and each entity reciprocally contributes to the intertwined becoming of the whole. Existing structures are broken down, and new forms emerge from their components, locking together in unprecedented ways. Life is therefore a process of production, which generates the new and the diverse, most often out of conditions of instability and disruption. New emergent structures may subsequently fall into repetitive patterns, which can have a machine-like quality. Deleuze and Guattari describe the inorganic the organic and the plastic or social, as different intensities or strata of processes, which are nonetheless comparable rather than contrasting. Indeed, one of the objectives of an investigation into all this might be to understand how these different levels of process constantly emerge out of each other and subside back. These arguments therefore acknowledge the distinctive character of organic life, but they recognise it as a specific and unusually complex instance rather than something categorically set apart. Processes of life are continually proceeding in the world around us, but in the case of organisms, these processes become stratified and bounded within a semi-autonomous entity. Taking a slightly pejorative view of this, Feng Sha suggests that organisms not so much embody life as imprison it. Yet organisms...
Hold on. Imprison life. The ancients tell us this house of residence was created for our spirit to enter. Consciousness enters the physical.
Are open and leaky systems which interpenetrate with their worlds. Indeed, they can't survive at all without being entangled and immersed in their settings. They may contain and depend upon vast numbers of viruses and microorganisms, be open to the world through respiration, take in and process food for sustenance, and absorb water and non-organic materials such as iron and calcium. There are also phenomena that are realised in movement and in growth, rather than existing whole and entire in a static or timeless form. So, what are the implications of this for thinking about archaeological residues? I'm arguing that there is not a dividing line, but a continuum between living and non-living matter. It's by now a commonplace to say that people don't impose themselves on the world from outside, and that their ability to act is always embedded within and negotiated through confederacies or alliances of diverse entities. Getting ahead of myself, including objects. But material things are not individually endowed with agency or intentionality or animated by some kind of internal vitality. And nor are they static or inert, for they're caught up in the broader processes of life and inextricably intermeshed with the growth, movement, sustenance and perishing of organisms. So, what I think I want to try and do is to radicalise Barrett's argument by proposing that societies, in Alfred North Whitehead's sense, are continually shifting, growing, decaying, and unequal heterogeneous assemblages of organic and non-organic entities. While I'm personally principally interested in the doings of human beings in the past, these will always mix up with a whole variety of different kinds of things in these machine entities, and never achieved anything in isolation. They were, as Mike Shanks would have it, always cyborgs. Action of past human action, nor the discarded material carapace. Instead, it's composed of surviving components that were integral to past living worlds or forms of life that existed at some point. An archaeology of organic and non-organic life, then, offers the possibility of directly accessing the vibrant but alien gatherings that formerly occupied our world. Thanks very much.
To my credit, my dog Cosmo Cal TV, we had a debate all night long, and one of the informations that he presented to me, and I didn't even realize, even though I've seen a video animation of cellular life penetrating the cell, but I didn't realize the information he presented to me. He said, you know that these cells swim and travel in a spiral. We was talking about the spiral rotation of certain energies, the currents in the ocean, the vitorial energies, etc., etc. And here it is, the sperm spiraling as they approach the cell and spiral itself right into the cell. Appreciate, shout out Cosmo and Cal. Also gotta point out, I've been hearing in the community of our so-called woke and conscious communities that genes and DNA, it's fake. They don't believe in it. Now, I will say it is possible that they're not showing you exactly what they're studying. So they got some surface information that gives you a general understanding of it, but it's not going to tell you the true nature of DNA and genes.
University, New York, of which I was once president, showed that genes were made of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. Avery and his colleagues were studying the bacteria that cause pneumonia.
Wait a minute now. See, that's what DNA is. It's made of a material that they just named. So that will also let you know that they don't fully understand that material. Okay? They, and maybe they do now. They're not going to tell you what they understand fully now. So keep that in mind.
They knew that the harmless strains of these bacteria could be transformed into dangerous, virulent forms when they were mixed with remnants of dead cells from a virulent strain. This change was then inherited. Avery reasoned that a gene had been passed as a chemical entity from the remains of the dead, harmful bacteria to the live, harmless bacteria, changing their nature forever. He went,
Hold on. That almost sounds like you can make a zombie now. That's just a surface off, I know my mind powerful. It ain't just something off the top of my fucking brain. But scientifically and logically, if you transmitted dead cell into a living cell and turned it into a viral, that's a zombie cell. So don't be surprised if they, start some Resident Evil type shit. And the corporation Umbrella start messing with these cells. They're already doing it, as Dr. Levin is. Because it'll go over people's head. But this guy here, Dr. Michael Levin, I've been watching him for some time. And I'm intrigued with his science. I'm intrigued with what he's doing. And a lot of people will be afraid, like he's playing God. But we're all gods. We're all the great Almighty One in the spirit. Okay? So I have no problem with it. It's just depending on if you determine yourself to be a good God or a bad God. That is the only question. Okay? So if Dr. Michael Levin is a good God, then this is great work he's doing. And this guy who's been manipulating single cells, he understands that these cells, most cells, are individual lives, which we've pointed out. And they have individual intelligence, which we've pointed out. And they are conscious, which we've pointed out. And he's finding out ways to manipulate them. I think that there's a few different use cases for the bots. The most obvious things are
we're going to make useful synthetic living machines for specific purposes. So maybe they drop off pro-regenerative molecules, maybe they clean up cancer cells, maybe they scrape the plaque off your artery walls, maybe they clean up arthritic knee joints, they repair, retina or spinal cord, with like very specific things. So there'll be some of that. I think bigger picture, what both they and the Xenobots are a kind of platform in which we get to learn to control morphogenesis. So cracking the code, the mapping between the experiences you received as a cell and the pattern that a group of you are going to build. Because if we solve that, that's a completely different path to regenerative medicine that has nothing to do with the bots per se. In other words, at some point, we're going to know how to grow a new heart, how to grow new limbs, how to grow new organs, and the stuff what we're working on right now in the lab, which is trying to understand why do they forget? Why do tissues forget what the correct pattern is? Why does everything fall apart after some number of decades, right? So using the bots as a kind of sandbox platform to understand how do collections of cells make decisions about what they're going to do. So that's kind of the second thing. And then there's a more philosophical stuff. But for biomedicine, right, there are the direct use cases, and then there's the bigger picture of what we really want is complete control over growth and form. That's what we really want.
Do you imagine that to be like an in situ process at the end of the day, or is it ex vivo? Are you going to be growing do you imagine these medical technicians, I don't know how many years from now, are growing these externally and replacing diseased organs, or is it more something that's happening inside of the body, like you're actually in the sense reprogramming your body or giving it the external environment that it needs in order to regenerate itself? It seems like two very different approaches.
Yeah, I think long term it's all going to be in situ, and in the meantime, are we going to crack the ex vivo morphogenesis and transplant before we crack the in vivo stuff? I'm not sure. Down the line, it's all going to be in vivo, but maybe the bioengineered organs will get cracked first. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, so you could argue both ways. On the one hand, you could say, well, just growing a single specific organ should be easier, and then we'll just pop it in. Maybe, but look at for example the case. So back in 2010 or so, we show that there's a particular bioelectric pattern that causes frog embryos to make new eyes in weird locations. Eyes on the gut, on the tail, whatever. We are nowhere near being able to bioengineer and grow an eye in vitro. Right. I mean, so people have shown, like, if you explant the eye progenitor cells and you sort of leave them alone, they can make an optic cup and some things like that. But it's not that we knew how to engineer an eye. Eyes are very complex. They have lots of different tissue types. What we simply did was to take advantage of the competency of the material, meaning the cells of the in vivo, they know how to make an eye. They've already done it twice. They certainly have all that information. What you need to be able to do is convince them to do it again somewhere else. And so if you look at this problem as, can I micromanage the cells to be an organ, using traditional bioengineering, maybe we make a bladder, maybe we make, ears are not hard. We can make things where we can make a scaffold, we seed a bunch of cells on top, so maybe 3D print some things. Maybe, you might think that's the way to go, but I actually think the easier way to do it is not to try to control any of that. It's to convince the collective what you want them to build and just do that in vivo, where the surrounding material is basically much smarter than we are about how it's done.
Well, this is, a dysfunctional example, but prions seem like they're the transfer of information without any kind of organ or genetic relationship.
Yep.
She about to give you another banger. She been banging them left and right. Here she go.
Yep, I agree. I think prions are a kind of non-genetic inheritance. Glanzman shows RNA. So he trains these aplasia, and he takes extracts RNA and injects it into a new animal, and they acquire some of the information. Yeah.
It's just really fascinating because when we were talking about the tadpoles with the eyes, some of them are wired into the brain and some of them can see without being wired into the brain. And so you have all of a sudden this new framework for understanding even something as basic as visual perception, where we equate it from conventional frameworks as being a necessary, eye-brain relationship. And so if you start to release that and all of a sudden it's actually in the body, does that radically change the way that we have to consider of bodies and minds and consciousness? To me, it's
Of course, you gotta change and go back to the original ancestral way. All things are alive. All things stem from the consciousness of the Supreme One.
seems like it must.
Yeah, I think so. I think that all of this has a lot to say about fundamentally what we are, and what it is that persists through time, and where things are encoded. I mean, in planaria, you can chop them into multiple pieces, and each of those pieces will become an animal. And that's, in philosophy of mind 101, you go over this example of the malfunctioning transporter, right? So it sort of replicates you, puts a copy over there, but it forgets to delete the old Star Trek episode, right? Like it forgets to delete the original, and now which one's the real one? Well, yeah, you can do that you can actually do that in planaria. So I think our concept of this idea that there's a discrete border between me and not me, between yourself and the outside world, between different individuals, between the memories that belong to you or the memories that belong to somebody else. I think our conceptions of all that stuff are pretty primitive and probably wrong.
Did you hear that? We gotta rewind that, bro. I hope I can get it right at that mark. He basically is telling you we're all one supreme mind, body, soul. We're all one organism.
Where things are encoded. I mean, in planaria, you can chop them into multiple pieces, and each of those pieces will become an animal. And that's, in philosophy of mind 101, you go over this example of the malfunctioning transporter, right? So it sort of replicates you, puts a copy over there, but it forgets to delete the old Star Trek episode, right? Like it forgets to delete the original, and now which one's the real one? Well, yeah, you can do that you can actually do that in planaria. So I think our concept of this idea that there's a discrete border between me and not me, between yourself and the outside world, between different individuals, between the memories that belong to you or the memories that belong to somebody else. I think our conceptions of all that stuff are pretty primitive and probably wrong.
You hurt me, boy. You hurt
You
yourself.
mentioned the danger of overfitting with training machine learning models, and that links to this kind of tangentially, where I think that the way that I've been thinking about consciousness and awareness and intelligence has to do with the presence of a sensory system that can then integrate information and then have effects upon the world. And when we discuss the ability of computer scientists to produce consciousness or intelligence, to me, I always see there being a limitation in these sensory systems. I'm like, yeah, you can have a brain on a chip, but in order for that to be something that I recognize as conscious, it has to be tied into some kind of body that is able to process multiple modes of sensory information, integrate them, and then apply them to goal-directed behavior. And if there is not a necessity for a brain, the way that I've conventionally thought about it, it really changes the way that I think about.
Yeah, it shatters your belief systems. It shatters the scientific model of today. Completely shatters it, because you are not the brain. The brain is an instrument, a tool that you use. So who are you? You are the consciousness. And he just said it just previously. There's no difference between me and you and him. We all one consciousness. Get over it, lady. And that's the proof of God, the Supreme One.
Machine consciousness, because as we start to develop these systems, and even if they're not embodied in the way that I'm used to thinking of embodied systems, it seems like we are opening the door into what Don Hoffman calls, like another conscious portal that we're booting up.
Well, a couple of things. First, I would be really careful.
Yeah, be careful. Talking about yap. Be very careful, because we're not opening another door or portal to consciousness. Consciousness is the door, is the portal, is the essence, is the everything. We are not doing nothing to consciousness. How are we opening the portal to consciousness? We do nothing to consciousness. Consciousness does us. And he's about to correct her. Be careful.
Not to lump consciousness and intelligence in the same bucket. I don't think these are synonyms, and so we have to, I think, talk about them separately. With respect to embodiment, I would say that I agree with you that some sort of perception action loop is really important, but I don't think three-dimensional space is the only space in which to do that. And so if you're doing that in physiological state space, or you're doing it in transcriptional space, or you're doing it in anatomical morphospace, or metabolic space, or linguistic space, I think that's good enough. I don't think there's anything, I don't think this three-dimensional space is privileged. I think we treat it that way because that's how our sensory motor system developed, and we're really used to things that move around well in the three-dimensional world being the interesting, intelligent things like us. But that's just, I think that's just prejudice on our part. I think these other spaces in which other beings strive and suffer are equally real. It's prejudice on our part. I think these other spaces in which other beings strive and suffer are equally real. It's prejudice on our part. I think these other spaces in which other beings strive and suffer are equally real. And
what? Did you hear that? That other beings strive and do well. Other spaces. What other spaces are you talking about, Dr. Levin? We're not going to let that slide over the heads of the folk, the common folk. He just said it. He just said it. Oh, I ain't going to rewind it.
And so you can have embodiment that is not obvious to us, that is in these other spaces. What was the last thing? There was a third thing. Oh, well, and so another example of that is people with locked-in syndrome, right? So you can be locked-in syndrome where you have basically zero ability to have functional efficacy in terms of anybody noticing you doing anything, but you're perfectly conscious, and you've got a rich inner life. So I think we have to be careful, and I think it used to be that intelligence and consciousness were very closely tied together. I think that evolution kind of makes sure that those things go together, and things that are naturally evolved, you can kind of gauge one from the other. Probably, like, again, we really don't know, right? So the other minds problem is serious when you start to think about unconventional things. Like it's pretty easy to say, oh, come on, I know you and I both have minds, even though I don't have access to yours, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Well, that's easy until you get to things that don't actually look like you or are made of something different, right? It gets really hard. Intelligence is easy because problem solving ability is a third person verifiable objective competency. First person consciousness is different and difficult. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's much wider than we normally think, and it's not hard to come up with cases that basically break almost any. I mean, this is one of the main things I work on now, is to try to, one of my TAME framework is trying to do is to come up with a framework for understanding cognition and agency in across extremely diverse embodiments. because all of the existing frameworks, they break very easily with biological examples. Most of the things that people walk around, kind of talking about, okay, here's my criterion, you can come up with, 7 examples that will just like crush it within minutes. It's pretty easy.
He basically saying he could debunk anything. You think it'll get debunked based on the scientists? The science is in trouble. It is in trouble. Oh my goodness.
Be talking to us about non-organic life. Be talking to us about non-organic life. Be talking to us about non-organic life.
to consciousness, but they won't create consciousness. That was all I was saying.
Interesting.
So
I think we disagree about that.
okay, so
But you're
so
so
we can
much
go
more
into that.
thoughtful
Okay.
and so much farther ahead. When we get there, I will
Yeah,
lay out my
absolutely. Okay.
ignorant perspective.
So on consciousness being fundamental,
Meaning that's all there is.
that's right. So the idea would be, and this is, by the way, in some sense, not new. Leibniz, in his monadology, had the same idea. So
I really appreciate that you assume I know what that means. And from context, I can tease it out. But can you tell us what that means?
so Leibniz was this genius, contemporary of Newton, sort of a antagonistic. They both invented calculus at roughly the same time. There was a question about who was first and so forth, and they were sort of at each other, but they were contemporaries. But Leibniz had this idea that consciousness couldn't emerge from physical systems. He has a famous argument of the mill, where he in one paragraph basically dismisses the idea that objects inside space and time, like neurons, for example, could create consciousness. For him, it was so obvious that he spent a paragraph on it and moved on. And then he's got a book called The Monadology, where he was proposing essentially that consciousness, perceiving entities, are the fundamental reality, and that they were interacting.
All right. If I break down the words monadology,
Monad, so MONAD is a
Monad.
technical term
Got it,
for
got
him.
it, got
It was a new term for him. Monadology is then the book's name, Monadology, and it was basically, it was a dynamics. It was a strange dynamics we called a pre-established harmony, where God. So he brought God in on his thing, I believe, to sort of coordinate all the perceptions of these. So
meaning God was the first mover, the
yeah,
fundamental
the fundamental,
thing.
right?
Okay, but he saw it as a creator,
Uh,
touching things with like a divine spark of consciousness.
Yeah, but his ontology was that
See how they kind of mocking it a little bit? But the guy was Einstein's counterpart or contemporary, whatever he said. And they both invented calculus. But is it because he saw that this supreme so-called simulation is God, the supreme being, the supreme life? So it cannot be fake, even though it seems to be a simulation that we live in. I understand why, if consciousness is the fundamental, then everything else is a simulation. But it is real because the supreme is real. It's not the simulation in the sense of what everybody is trying to make. They cannot make it.
the fundamental reality beyond space-time was these monads, these perceiving entities, basically. And but God, I think, was the deepest reality for Leibniz. There, I'm less secure. The I'm not sure exactly what his thoughts were on God, but I believe that's what he said. So I just brought that up just to say that we're not the first to have this kind of idea. Centuries ago, Leibniz, with his monadology, had an idea that perceiving entities, experiencing entities, could be more fundamental than the physical space-time world.
All right, you talk about conscious
Yeah.